collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, we'll hear about medical cannabis. It's been much in the news recently, and we'll discuss whether it should be legalised in Cyprus and what uses it can be put to.
What Cyprus now is going to do, there's a legislation that is under parliamentary discussion, and we hope to conclude the discussion very soon so we can have a legal framework for the use of medical cannabis.
We'll also talk to one of the co-founders of the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland. They've been in Cyprus talking to women on both sides of the divide about how women can help peace processes.
The reality is, and we learnt it the hard way, it's no good talking to your friends in a bubble. The people you have to talk to are the people that actually instinctively disagree with you. So, to sort of say, look, there's just a vacuum there because in terms of power politics or geopolitical politics, we don't want to recognise it, is fine, except that it's not going to take you very far forward.
Medical cannabis and the use of cannabinoids for medical treatment have been much in the news over the last couple of years. Now, here in Cyprus, they're only allowed to be prescribed, I think I'm right in saying, in very special circumstances and with the explicit permission of the Ministry of Health. But there have been some recent conferences on this issue, and joining us is somebody who spoke at the last one. He is Dr. George Samoudis. He's a family practitioner and also an associate professor at the St George's Medical School in Nicosia. So, George, let's start, please, at the beginning, and that is we need to distinguish between the different components of cannabis and its use medicinally, because there's the bit that gets you high, which I think is THC, and then there are all the other CBDs and other things like that that are mostly used for medicinal purposes. So can you very simply tell us the difference?
Yeah, we know that the compounds that we can find actually in the plant, more than 100 different chemical compounds known as cannabinoids. The two we use now in the medical field is the THC, which is a tetrahydrocannabinol, and the CBD, which is the cannabidiol. So the difference of those two is that THC has a psychoactive effect, whereas the CBD hasn't had any psychoactive effect. That's why many people will notice that you may find CBD online in Europe, for example, from Switzerland or other countries, and you can get them actually online, but it's illegal to get a compound that has a supplement or a drug that has THC. So THC has a psychoactive and the CBD has a non-psychoactive effect. Now, we use both of them in combination in many clinical approaches, because the ratio between THC and CBD has something that yet we need to do more research to see what is the best ratio for a specific disease to use.
Now, what diseases are currently being treated? Because it seems that almost every week a new one comes on the list, and we've heard about, for example, childhood epilepsy. That's particularly been in the news recently, but so too, more recently, have some of the cancers. So what at the moment do we understand its best use is for?
The current, approach is that predominantly we use medical cannabis for cancer, and especially for palliative care, for end-stage diseases. And this is where actually our Ministry of Health in Cyprus is providing mainly the approval for using medical cannabis in Cyprus is for cancer patients, especially patients that are taking palliative care. But, as you said, we have some new fields now open for the use of medical cannabis, such as the epilepsy, such as multiple sclerosis. But we need to pay attention to these, that research is coming now. The first actually medication that is approved by the FDA is called Epidiolex. It's cannabidiol, and it's been now approved by the FDA for epilepsy, especially in children, as you correctly said. So it's a British company that produced it recently. So we're now entering in a new field, in a new era for medical cannabis use. And we need to be very careful in terms of not to go to extremes. Firstly, to consider it as panacea, so that can treat everything. Or on the other side, to be very skeptic and reject the use of medical cannabis. So we need to be careful and use selectively in the cases that is indicated under physicians that have been trained in the medical cannabis use, because that's another issue that...
a lot of doctors who are practicing now have never even come across it, have they?
Not a lot. Almost all of them, I would say, specifically in Cyprus. So we need to be careful in terms of where we use it and who is using it, under which guidance and directions.
I have to say that the attitude to drugs here in Cyprus, and particularly to cannabis, for years has been cannabis is as bad as morphine and heroin and all the crack cocaines and whatever. So there's, in a sense, a predisposition, it seems to me, in Cypriot society to reject this as an option. How does that pan out when you have your conferences and so on?
Yeah, this is true. But this is a concept, this is an attitude that this is not only for the Cypriots. This is an attitude we notice in many, many countries. I'm sure that listeners are aware of what happened in the UK recently, that a child with epilepsy that was under medical cannabis doing fantastically well, the government did not approve to continue with the import of the medication from the States. And
until an outcry changed their mind. It has been changed.
Until a public outcry pushed the Ministry of Health to change their mind and took the initiative to provide the medication to the specific child. So the societies, the politicians, the healthcare professionals, all of us, we need to get educated on this issue. It's an emerging issue. It's an emerging treatment. And of course, we need always to have in mind that we need to move on based on the evidence. So this is should be an evidence-based approach, and we need to be open, of course, at the same time for these new treatments and this new use of the cannabis. Can I add something?
Yeah.
So what I wanted to add is about the legislation in Cyprus. I think a very important step, not only for Cyprus, of course, but for all countries, is to consider the framework of the use of medical cannabis. So in Cyprus currently, as we all know, it's illegal to use medical cannabis, except for those patients that they get approval directly from the Minister of Health. So the access is very limited. What Cyprus now is going to do, there's a legislation that is under parliamentary discussion, and we hope to conclude the discussion very soon, so we can have a legal framework for the use of medical cannabis. And the name, of course, of the legislation is the cultivation, the provision of medicinal cannabis in Cyprus. And I think it's extremely important to get this legislation approved ASAP, so we have a framework for the provision on one side, but from the other side, I think it's extremely important for Cyprus to invest in terms of the cultivation of medical cannabis, because this will provide a lot of opportunities for Cyprus in terms of course, for business development. I think the plan is to provide 2 licenses, because there's a huge demand in medical cannabis worldwide now, and the weather in Cyprus is perfect. I had many discussions with experts on this. They say that's probably one of the most ideal places
to grow cannabis, and of course we've got a very good pharmaceutical industry here anyway.
Excellent. So it's an opportunity that if we implement it, execute this opportunity in the right way, this could provide a lot of opportunities for Cyprus in terms of business development, but also in terms of research, education, and at the same time the correct and the right use of medical cannabis in medical practice.
If Parliament gets a move on and does it quicker than most things. But let's go back to the medical application. There's so much cancer around these days, all different types of cancer, but things I've read recently suggest that medical cannabis can actually slow the growth of tumours, and in certain cancers can even help sort of cut off the blood supply so the tumour can't grow. That's not a cure perhaps, but it's certainly going to slow down the progress. Which cancers are really at the front line of the use of this sort of medication?
Firstly, we need to clarify that we haven't got yet an FDA, for example, approved medical cannabis for the cancer management. So what we have now is some empirical data, and of course some research data as well, that supports the argument that especially, and this is where it's quite safely, I would say, somebody to attempt to try and use medical cannabis in the palliative care field. So the palliative care field is where we have the diseases that are not curable diseases, and patients that we want to do, of course, control their symptoms, for example, for nausea, for vomiting. We have studies showing better results of these symptoms using medical cannabis.
And I think sometimes better results from the chemotherapy for people who are taking cannabis.
This is a bit of a radical approach. We cannot argue now that medical cannabis is better than chemo.
No, in conjunction with it, it gives the chemotherapy better results.
That's different. So we've got there is data showing that if you combine medical cannabis with chemotherapy in specific cancers, specific, of course, indications, then you may have some synergistic effect. But this is, as I said, something which is under research. That's why we need to be very careful when we say something, because we've got people hearing us and they may get some false hopes or they get excited about it. So we have to be always very careful for what we support in terms of these treatment approaches. That's why I said it's something that seems to be promising, is not panacea. In this specific moment, I would suggest that we use it for palliative care, but we need to be open-minded and explore the other use in other conditions. As I said before, the new medication that we discussed before that has been FDA approved, the Epidiolex, which is for epilepsy for specific pediatric cases. So this should be our approach.
There are people listening who possibly have a cancer. They know it's terminal. What would you say to them? I mean, if they have the opportunity and they know that nothing else is going to help them, should they not be able to take medical cannabis? I mean, even if you think of the placebo effect, it could be that they'll gain a little bit more time.
This is what I said before in palliative care. So you have an incurable cancer and you're in an end stage, and then you need to do at least a symptom control. Then this is an area that I say that the medical society need to consider of introducing medical cannabis and do more research, etc. I'm aware of the recent data about the slow growth of cancer that has been reported. But as I said, we need to have cumulative data. We have animal studies now. We need to do some more studies. Phase 4 studies, that's how we call them, in real patients and real environment, and be able to obtain the best data out of these experiments and trials. So I think if I can make a conclusion to this discussion, is that medical cannabis does open a new window for looking the scientists for a new tool, a new medication, a new weapon in our to use for caring for patients. But this opportunity needs to be very carefully managed in terms of legislation, in terms of research, in terms of education of the healthcare professionals and of the public, because the risk is that we disproportionate, consider it as a panacea. The risk is to be prejudiced against the use of medical cannabis, and the risk is to follow a pathway that's not evidence-based, is not scientifically proven. So if we very carefully design the development of the use of medical cannabis in the clinical field, I think we give us another option for our patients.
And that is Dr. George Samoutis, who's a family practitioner and an associate professor at the St George's Medical School in Nicosia, talking about medicinal cannabis.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Moloch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
First of all, let me apologise in advance for the presence of a rogue mobile phone in the vicinity of the next interview. I hope it doesn't impinge on your enjoyment of the chat. You may recall that we spoke last week to one of the co-founders of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition movement. She was in Cyprus for screenings of Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, a film that tells the story of the movement and its impact on the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Avila Kilmurray is the other co-founder, and when I spoke to her, she told me that the coalition movement came about because women had been active across the years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
They've been active within the civil rights movement, they've been active in the trade union movement, and they've been active particularly in the community-based women's movement. However, they'd never really made a breakthrough into the formal politics, because our formal politics, as in many conflict areas, was very narrow, very rigid, and very much controlled by basically about four men, who were the main spokespersons over decades. And we had a legacy of failed negotiations, peace processes, whatever else. So whenever we had the paramilitary ceasefires in 1994, there was a new process put in place, which by the British and Irish governments, which Senator George Mitchell was brought in from the States to chair. And there was the intent was to get all the protagonists around the table. The challenge for the governments was Sinn Féin, for the political side of the IRA, the Republicans, were going to be there anyway, they were going to be elected. But how did they get the small loyalist paramilitary groups to the table? So both those groups were encouraged to set up political parties, and the government introduced a novel electoral system, which was a collective vote right across Northern Ireland, and the top 10 parties that got the top 10 votes were going to get 2 representatives each at the peace table. We could get elected because it's 10 parties, and there's the ability to garner all these votes from across Northern Ireland. Initially, to be honest, we actually didn't think we were going to get elected. But we were so fed up of lobbying all the established political parties to put some of the women's issues in their agendas, and they ignored us, that we said, right, we're going to set up a new structure to give them a shock.
So was it a political party you set up?
It was. Well, we never called it a political party because we called it deliberately a coalition. Because we sort of said, OK, not only do we want to get women at the table and to get a range of women's issues on the table, but we actually want to conceive of politics in a different way. As I say, our politics have been very narrowed. So a coalition meant that we had 2 leaders, one from the Catholic community, one from the Protestant Unionist community, shared leadership. We had a series of 3 principles rather than a whole plethora of policies, because we knew we were never going to be the Minister for Agriculture, so why have a policy on poultry production? So the principles were human rights, inclusion, and equality.
And I suppose it broadened the whole base of the way people looked at how to overcome the differences.
Absolutely, it did that, but it also broadened the way that people looked at politics, because not only in Northern Ireland, but across Europe and America, politics has become so professionalised that people sort of said, oh, well, we can't be involved, you have to have all sorts of money behind you, whatever else. We set up the coalition and fought and won that election in 6 weeks. So what we're also trying to say to young people is, look, politics is about life. Politics, and over the years, women's groups used to talk about being involved in politics with a small p, socioeconomic issues, cultural issues, as compared to politics with a big P, which was always about territoriality, the border, who was going to carve up what ministries or whatever else. So what we were saying is we can bring these two together.
Right, but if we look at politics across the globe these days, it's still very much how it's always been.
True.
And the challenge, if you like, is to try and persuade young, disenchanted people who have the vote and have their lives ahead of them that they can get involved somehow and make a difference, even if it's at a local level.
Exactly.
And there does seem to be a slight change in the public's attitude these days. If you look at the UK, for example, and the huge upsurge in the Labour Party, because people have suddenly felt that actually what they think does matter.
Exactly, and essentially what we were trying to do is to create a political movement, a bit like, as you say, something like the Labour Party today. But also, I think, to actually say to people, look, it might be small, but you can actually make a difference. Because I think one of the things that puts off particularly younger people is they sort of say, well, why should we do it? We can't see, it's all tied up. We can't make a difference. So what we did was, we got hundreds of women along. And the other thing that we did was, because it was garnering as many votes as possible across the whole of Northern Ireland, we put an ad in the paper. And we said, right, any woman that's interested in politics, that's prepared to subscribe to an inter-community party, that's prepared to accept the 3 principles of human rights, equality and inclusion, contact us. Come along to a meeting. And, we will encourage you to stand. So over our 6-week period, we got 98 women to stand for election. And that was actually ticked one of our objectives. Because for many years, the established political parties say, oh, well, now, Avila, we'd love to have women standing, but we can't find any. So, well, hey, we found 98. But in that case, it was in 3 weeks.
OK, but what about today? I mean, are women still involved in the day-to-day politics of Northern Ireland?
So, yes, we still have a long way to go, but it did have an impact. And I mean, the insults that we got thrown at us, the hen party and go back to the kitchen, go back and breed for Ulster, you wouldn't get that now.
So let's come to Cyprus and what you've been doing apart from showing the film while you've been on the island. I think you've had a lot of meetings, haven't you?
So we've had a range of different impressions, and clearly we're outsiders, so all we can do is share our experience. Some of it will be appropriate, others not. I suppose a couple of impressions. One is there's an opportunity, because ironically, given that there is a hiatus in terms of the political negotiations, now's the time for women to organise. Because if all the attention is in the macro negotiations, then they get squeezed out. But you actually have to, like we did in the years during the Troubles, you actually have to do your local organising when there's a bit of a vacuum. And there's more opportunity then to get people together. Secondly, the need to develop multi-layer strategies. So yes, it's really great to have the feminist networks and the Cyprus Women's Lobby and people like that.
They're already involved.
True.
It's very much, isn't it, a need to get ladies who are cooking lunch.
Exactly.
Or looking after their grandchildren.
Yes.
To say, I want to be part of that.
That's right.
What can I do? How do you engage them?
You engage them by actually listening rather than talking. So going back and sort of saying, so taking someplace like Famagusta, where we had 23 women of different ages, to actually sort of to sit down with them and sort of say, OK, so what are the issues here? Where are the entry points? Not just to ask them what their needs are or what they want, but, what's kept them going? What's the resilience? And they all have assets. They're all bringing something. What are the issues? And in our case, a lot of those issues will be around putting food on the table, paying the rent, socioeconomic issues, and starting where people are at. And then gradually, sort of over time, and it does take time, and not just sort of one-off meetings, but consistent meetings, trying to identify then what are the common issues that are coming out of a whole series of those meetings that people can be brought together on, and that people can own, rather than somebody coming in with an outside agenda and saying, you have to talk about reconciliation. That can come. I mean, we still have problems talking about reconciliation. The reality is, and we learnt it the hard way, it's no good talking to your friends in a bubble. The people you have to talk to are the people that actually instinctively disagree with you. So, to sort of say, look, there's just a vacuum there because in terms of power politics or geopolitical politics, we don't want to recognise it, is fine, except that it's not going to take you very far forward. So, and I think actually the ones that can take the step to go forward on that front are the community-based groups in civil society and people like women, because they can be the research and development side of the politics. We can't expect our elected politicians or leaders to do it, because they'll be looking over their shoulder to say, what will we lose?
How was the film received? What was the reaction, again, particularly of women in the audience?
It was received very well. I think partially because what we were saying in the film is, look, no matter how bad things are, you have to almost put on your lateral thinking hat. I mean, people thought we were mad, and we probably were mad whenever we set up the coalition and started knocking doors to look for votes. But it actually worked. Now, a lot of things we didn't work, but you need to actually be prepared just to do things differently and not be constrained by somebody else's memos of understanding or whatever else. And one thing that I was really delighted at the showing last night, 3 young students in the university came up and said, 2 girls and a young man, and the 2 young girls sort of said, well, we've never been over to the northern part of Cyprus, but we're going next Tuesday.
So there's hope for us yet. We've been talking to one of the co-founders of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and they were here to talk to women and men, I guess, on both sides of the divide in Cyprus, along with showings organised by the Irish Embassy to Nicosia of the film Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs. Thank you very much indeed to Dr. Avila Kilmurray.
Thank you.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
And on the culture front this week, the International Faros Contemporary Music Festival is celebrating its 10th anniversary. It was the first festival of new music ever inaugurated in Cyprus back in 2009, and it has premiered many well-established masterpieces of the 20th century. It also promotes the work of the younger generation of composers from all over the world. It's being organised between the 5th and 14th of October, so it kicks off tonight at the Shoe Factory in Nicosia, and it will be bringing the Ensemble Modern, Klangforum Wien, Pierre-Laurent Aymar and Tamara Stefanovic. The festival is under the artistic direction of prominent Cypriot composer Evis Samoudis, and it will encompass an array of concerts, educational activities and interactive workshops. You can find out more if you visit the Faros Arts Foundation website. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.